I'm good.
No,
Thank you so much.
No, no,
Thank you.
thank you.
We're showing on the camera.
Zok the Hedel Gemara.
Thank you, thank you.
Shkoyach Shol for bringing breakfast. It'll make the fast go faster. So we were looking for a makar that shchutei chutz. We found a law for. We found a hasara for. Halah b'chutz. We found a law for. We found a hasara for, and we also found a makar that even if, which is to the Rabbanan of our Mishnah, where even if it was already shechted b'chutz and it's really a pasul of carbon, halah b'chutz will also be aser. And the Gemara said if there's two halahs b'chutz that are aser, halah b'chutz when the shechita was b'fnim, and halah b'chutz when the shechita was b'chutz. So when the Mishnah lists off that there's 36 avers that get kares, in fact, the Mishnah should have said there's only there's even 37. Zog to Gemara kasha. Now, at the end of yesterday, we were sort of rushed, and Rashi goes through a little bit in detail the Mishnah that talks about the 36 creases, and Rashi points out that it doesn't really list off every chiv kares. It lists off Chilul Shabbos, but by Chilul Shabbos there's 39 malachas, but it's Shem Shabbos Chadahu. So Rashi asks, Oy bazoi, why didn't the Gemara just say that Shem Halah Chadahu? And it's counted as, we counted as one header. And Rashi makes a distinction between if the Mishnah lists it as one or not, and since our Mishnah doesn't list it, and it's an add-on, it's completely separate. So there's different nuances why the Gemara feels here. It should have said that there's 37 krisos, but I'll call upon them. The Mishnah there says there's only 36 general categories of cars. Which takes us to the next sugya of Adatna. Hazoyrek miktas davan b'chutz. Until now we learned about shchita b'chutz and ha'alah b'chutz. What about zrika b'chutz? So it says in the Mishnah, even hazoyrek miktas davan b'chutz will be chayiv. We know that no matter how many zrikas different karbanos require, we learned earlier in the Masechta that if you made one zrika at least, one matnas dam at least, then for sure it's going to be kosher. As Rashi points out, over here it says, Shaloi Nosar Abramatos Matonach is chayiv to have a zrika b'fnim b'chavosei. It's non kol nitna ala mizbeach achitzoin shenitnon b'matana achas kiper. The only time each of the individual matanas are ma'akev are by the chatois hapnimius, where you have to have the special zrikas on the paroiches, on the mizbeach hapnimi, but the chatois, anything where the zrika goes shvished on the outside mizbeach, one b'diavad will be enough. So Zok to Gemara, the Mishnah says, Hazork even miktas davan b'chutz chayiv minalon. How do we know that zrika is also covered by this isser of chutz? Nafkalei miditanya. It says dam yechal shev l'rabbi hazorek divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Where does it say dam yechal shev? So let's look at the Torah or Vel Pesach hamoed le'aviu lahakriv korban Hashem l'fnei mishkan Hashem dam yechal shev lish hahu dam shafach. That is, I believe, in the parasha that was talking about shchita. So zrika is an add-on to the chiyuv kares that the Torah expresses by the iser shchita. L'Rabbi Hazorek divrei Rabbi Shmuel. V'kiva imer oy zavach l'Rabbi Hazorek. Let's see where that is. V'aleim timer ishish mi beisis yom nagar sheyar v'zechem asher yada oyla oy zavach. That's referring to Zrika as well, Oizavach, and I believe that's by the parsha of Halah. I might be mistaken, it might be the opposite. Correct the more Rabbi Shmuel, Hi Oizavach, my Ovidlay. What does he do with the extra word of Oizavach that Rabbi Kiva uses to teach us that this prohibition includes Zrikas? Well, there's a Gemara L'chalak. He uses L'chalak to tell you that no matter how many times you do this, if you do zrika, if you do halah, you get a separate chiyuv kars or a separate chiyuv chatos for each one. As Rashi says, lichalek The loitema adamasik oilo shlamim. So my mistake. It says oilo oizavach. It says ashiyala oilo oizavach. You would think unless you're mila b'chutz, saya carbon oila, and saya carbon shlomim, you're not over shchut chutz. Kamash shalom is even one carbon that will be mechayiv you for shchut chutz. So that's what he does with oizavach. How does Rabbi Akiva know that each individual carbon that you would bring would trigger such a chiv? Navkale miloyevi enu, which is loshen yochid. The carbon you shall not bring in the wrong place, even one carbon. Rabbi Shmuel, what does he use loyevi enu for? Chumaboyele ala shalem hu chayiv ve'ene chayiv ala chaser. You're not chayiv if you are makriv a davar chaser. It's a big machloikis what they mean. The Gemara is going to discuss it later. Doesn't mean if it's not a full behema. Doesn't mean if it's not a full aver. Doesn't mean if it's not a full kazayis. But there is halacha that a davar chaser doesn't have the din shchut chutz. Rabbi Akiva nafkalei milasais oisai a complete thing. Rabbi Yishmael chad lemakutrei pnim shechasru v'helu b'chutz v'chad lemakutrei chutz shechasru v'helu b'chutz. We already made a distinction between a carbon that you were shechted b'fnim and you were makar b'chutz, where only the chachamim hold there's a din of shchut chutz, and a carbon that everything was done b'chutz, where the shchita was b'fnim and the law was b'chutz. Everybody holds that there's a chiv of shchut chutz. But if they were both b'chutz, that means by the time you did the Allah b'chutz, the shchita has already been done b'chutz, and therefore the carbon's already possible. Only the chachamim hold that's called shchut chutz. You need a pasuk to tell you that sai by Allah b'chutz of a partial Allah, it will not be chayiv. Sai in the case of if the shchita was b'fnim, and sai if in the case where the shchita was b'chutz. The Rashi explains why you would need a special exemption for chaser for each of those cases, and you wouldn't say once we know what's exempt, it applies to both. Frag the Gemara, not frag the Gemara. Vatanya b'nichuser b'shma leimer yachal miktori pnim shechasru v'helu b'chutz chayiv Talmud leimer la soy ala sholem chayiv einei chayiv ala chaser. Gewaltig. So that's why you need la soy according to Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva muktari pnim shechasru v'helu b'chutz is going to be chayiv. Rabbi Akiva holds it will be chayiv. So therefore, he doesn't use lasses oisai to tell you that it's potter, because in fact he holds that it's chayiv. Rabbi Akiva ham dam yechashev ma'avatlei. Going back to the beginning of the sugya, how did Rabbi Shmuel know that there's a din of shchut chutz by zrika as well from dam yechashev? But Rabbi Akiva learned it out of Oizavach. So what's Rabbi Akiva going to do with dam yechashev? So to tell you that there's a din of shchut chutz, even if you shechted a carbon that was an oif, but shchita, not melika. Rabbi Shmuel, how does he know shchitas ha'oif would also be shchitas chutz? Me oy asher yishchat. Rabbi Akiva Amalach, he'll tell you oy asher yishchat. Homi boyle ala shoiched uchayiv v'loy ala moilek. Doing melika on the carbon b'chutz is not mechayiv. Rabbi Shmuel navkalei mizeh adavar. The Tanya we learned asher yishchat. Only ala shoiched behema. Shachat oif min olei that will be a chiyav of shchut chutz. You would have thought that someone who does malika b'chutz will also be chayiv for shchut chutz. V'dinu, the pasha the svara to argue that way. Ma shchita the ein derech hechsher b'fnim chayiv. Ma dech shchita where it's not the right way to do it in the Beis Hamikdash. Nevertheless, if you did it b'chutz you're chayiv. Malika should derech hechsher b'fnim. Surely Malika B'chut should be chayiv. Tamaloimer zahadavar. You're only chayiv for this thing. What is this thing? The Torah is referring to shchita. No. Correct. Rabbi Akiva Amalach Ahumi Boyele Zahadavar tells you l'gzereshav. The l'gzereshav of Zahadavar is something that we're somewhat familiar with, but it has nothing to do with our sugya. It's a gzera shava from Malika to Zeh Adavar by Yadarim. one of the halachas learned from this Zadavar is just like by Nidarim. You could be shoyal on a neder. So too, when you makdish something, because this is in the sugi of hektish, you could be shoyal on the hektish. You could be, if you made a carbon by mistake, you could be shoyal, make a nice carbon. So therefore, he uses Zadavar for that. And Rashi speaks out, could be Rabbi Shmuel holds that you cannot be shoyal on hektish. Sagt the Gemara weiter. Vadet nan hakoymetz v'amakabel damen b'chutz potter. If someone makes kmitza or make kabbalah sadam, those are not included in the iser of shchut echutz. So what are included to review is shchita sa'if, is shchita sa'behema, is halos hakarban on the mizbech, and zrika sadam. So it's not included is making the kmitza of a mincha, or being the kabel, the dam, the chutz potter. Rashi says it in a minute. Minolan, how do you know that they're potter? Correct the Gemara. What do you mean? How do I know that they're potter? The default is that they're potter. How do you know that they're chayiv? Why would you think they're chayiv? So Gemara because Taisa is shchita. I can learn from shchita. Just like shchita is an avodah. If it's done by chutz chayiv, so too kabbalah and kmitza is an avodah, and if you use b'chutz chayiv. Zok Gemara mal shchita shekein nefselas shaloi loichlin b'Pesach. We had this chumah one. Shchita has one interesting chumah. That if you shach the korban Pesach and you had in mind people who wouldn't be able to eat like a chayla or a zaken, the korban Pesach, the shchita is puzzle itself. That's a unique psul you only find by shchita by a korban Pesach. So shchita has in it a certain chumrah that by a korban Pesach, if it was shachted shaloi loichlin, it would be possible. So therefore, Taisim is Rika. Let's learn it from Zrika, because we learned that Zrika also is the din of Shchut. Mal Zrika shekein zor chayiv alay misa. Even though it's also for a zor to do kmitza, it's also for a zor to do kabbalas tamim, a zor will not be chayiv misa if he does that. As we learned earlier in the Masechta, a zor is only chayiv misa for doing an avodah that's a goymer. That's the end of a set. Kabbalah is in the middle of the set. Kabbalah is for the purpose of the Zrika. And the same thing with the kmitza, it's for the purpose of the makter, the kmitza on the mizbeach. Therefore, although a zar may not do that avodah, but if he does it, he's not chayiv misa. So Zot Kumar maybe Tasi. Let's learn it from Mi Beinaya, right? You can use shchita and zrika. If you say malach shchita that it passes shalol l'shem oichlin, I'll say zrika derech. If I say zrika is mechayiv misa, I'll say shchita derech. V'teisi mi Beinaya. If kein lo yemer b'zrika v'teisi mi Beinaya, v'teisi mi shchita. I'm sorry, v'teisi mi Beinaya, period. So that's why we would think. That's why we would think that there would be a chiv of shchut echutz, right? That was the whole thing. The Brayso says you're not chayiv for shchut echutz. The Tana comes to come out as potter mikulam. So the Gemara asks umehechadesh the chayiv. We would have thought it was chayiv. That the Mishnah needs to tell us that it's possible is because you would have been teisi mi beinayim. Okay, so fragt the Gemara obazoi v'teisi mishchita. Zok the Gemara v'teisi mishchita. Why don't you learn? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm right. So that was the Gemara's kasha. Was that's why the Brayso says that you're not chayiv for Kabbalah Saddam and for Malika and for Kmitza b'chutz. If that's the case, then why do I need a pasuk for Zrika? We just had a half a alma discussing how you know Zrika. Rabbi Kiva learned it from one pasuk from Oy Zavach, and Rabbi Shmuel learned it from Dami Shavach. We had machlokes where to learn from. Why do I need to learn from anywhere? Learn it from Shchita and Halah. Zot Gemara b'teisim Shchita. Mal Shchita shkein nefselas. Shalol yishem oichlin b'Pesach. Then teisim Halah. Mal Halah. Shkein yesh na b'mincha. Mincha has a mitzvah of Allah, but Zrika does not have a mitzvah of Allah. Zot Gemara, since lo yorei zeh karei zeh. Why do I need the pasuk to teach us that there is a din of shchut echutz by zrika b'chutz? Why can't we just know it from the combination of halah and shchita. That's why it says in the pasuk, the Torah says Rika, even though I didn't need the Torah to say Rika. The Torah didn't have to say Rika. It must be the Torah doesn't want Delimi Benaya, which would also be the reason how we know that Kmitza and Kabbalah are also not going to Kmitza and Kabbalah are also not going to be chayiv because you're not tasting me Benaya. That is something that is just simply not done. So Zok Gemara weiter. Amar Abavo, Shochat v'Zorak. If you shechted and you did zrika, now remember, according to, we'll see in a second. According to Rabbi Shmuel, the pasuk where Rabbi Shmuel knows zrika from is the pasuk of Dam Yechashev. Dam Yechashev is in the parsha of Shchita. So if it was Shochat v'Zorak, would you be mechayev two creases? No, because Shchita and Zerika are under the same heading of the Chi of Kares. So Shachat v'Zorak l'divrei Rabbi Shmuel, chayiv achas. You'll only be chayiv one Kares. But l'divrei Rabbi Akiva, you'll be chayiv shtayim because Rabbi Akiva learns Zorak from the parsha of Halah, and Shchita and Halah each have a separate halacha. Pasuk separately states, side by Shchita individually and side by Halah individually, that it has a Chi of Kares. But Abaye Amar afilu l'divrei Rabbi Akiva ein chayiv alachas. Even according to Rabbi Akiva, where you're learning the Chi of Kares of Shchita from one pasuk and the Chi of Shchita of Zerika from the pasuk of Allah, he's still moida. You'd only be chayiv one Kares. The Amar Kra Shom Tase Hakazav Asan L'Chula Navoida Achas. We had this Zereshov of Shom Shom, and the pasuk says the following. It says Shom Tala v'Shom Tase. So the Torah is comparing the Isur of Halah to v'Shom Tase to any other Isurim of Chutz combined. Hiskar Allah levada v'shar kolon basi achas lemermad le'mechayv akulu alachada. No matter what you do besides Halah, you are only chayiv one Chi of Kares. Okay, Gavaltik. What about Zorak v'Hela? The opposite. You did Zorak v'Hela. So then it's the opposite conclusion. L'divrei Rabbi Shmuel will be chayiv shtayim. Why? Because Hela is now under the heading of Zorak is under the heading of Shchita, and Hela is under the heading of Hela. But L'divrei Rabbi Akiva in chayiv alachas, because Rabbi Akiva learns from Oizavach includes Rika, which is part of the Chi of Kares that's stated by Halah. Abaye Amar afilu Rabbi Akiva chayiv shtayim. Comes along Abai to say that according to Rabbi Akiva, you'd be chayiv shtayim. Why? La'achipal ginu kra shom tala v'shom tase. Since it says shom tala v'shom tase, it tells you hisker halol avada v'shar kala b'siyachas. Remember the mechayiv akula lach. That's the first way, but the other way is hoitzi Allah mechlal shar asiyos lemember the mechayiv la b'pinavsha v'shar b'pinavshay. Maybe according to Rabbi Akiva b'chayiv shtayim, because the Torah says shom tala v'shom tase. Tala gets its own Chi of Kares by itself, and the other are various prohibited. By Chutz, will get their own Kares. However, Shochat v'Zark v'Hela, so you surely violated two separate mentions of Chiyuve Kares in the Torah, l'divrei kol chayiv shtayim, but not three. Because there's only two Chiyuve Kares mentioned there. Zarek is an add-on either to the Shchita or to the Zrika, but more than two Chiyuve creases they will not. Tanu Rabbanon. Now let's look at the gears over here. Tanu Rabbanon. Oy asher yishachet michutz al-machen. So let's have a look at the Loshna pasuk. Ishish mi beis Yisrael asher yishchat shor kesev oyes either ba-machane oy asher yishachet michutz al-machen. A very interesting way of saying this. So we learn michutz al-machane yochel chutz l'shalish machanos. I would have thought that you're not chayiv v'shchutei chutz unless you shecht not only in the Machane Levia or in the Machane Yisrael, but michutz mishalish machanos, completely out of the Machane. Talmud Loimer, Oy, Eis B'machna. Even in the Machna. Zok Gemara, Iba Machna, Yochel HaShoichet, Oyla B'dorim Yoichayiv. I would have thought that if you're out of the right zone, even though you're within the Machna, for instance, you're in the Azara, and you're supposed to shech the carbon b'tzafayin, if it was that type of carbon, and you shech the b'dorim, maybe that's also chiyuv shchut echos. Talmud Loimer, Oyel michutz l'machna. Ma chutz l'machna, miyuchud, she'en roy l'shchita as kachim, u'l'shchita kol zavach. Just like michutz l'machna is not a royu for any carbon, not just for kachim, but it's not royu for any carbon. Yotze darim is not going to trigger a chiyuv shchut echutz. Shav apishin royal l'shchitas kachim, even though you're not supposed to say kachim, only b'tzavon royal l'shchitas kachim kal. So now we learned that even chutz l'machna achas, even out of the azara, is a chiyuv shchut echutz, but in the azara, even if it's the wrong place in the azara, will not be chayiv al shchut echutz. Okay, now we're going to have an interesting thing. I remember when I lived in Israel, there was a non-glatt kosher restaurant that was a meat restaurant that was in the basement of the Plaza Hotel. Remember what it was called? It was called Cow on the Roof. You don't remember such a, now you remember, right? Cow on the Roof. Amar Ula HaShoichet al Gagoy Shel Heichel. What if you had a cow on the roof and there was an animal that was on the roof of the Heichel? Is that, are you chayiv for shchut echutz for that? Zokt Ula chayiv. You're going to be chayiv for shchut echutz. Why? Hoyel ve'ein royu l'shchitas kol zavach. There is no zavach who its proper place is the roof of the Heichel. Matzkav la Rava. Correct, Rava. If you're going to tell me that the roof of the Heichel, which is within the confines of the Beis Hamikdash complex, if you're going to tell me that that's considered chutz, in Cain, you know what the pasuk should have said? Nifta kwa michutz lamachna. But the pasuk sticks in another clause. It says, "Vel Pesach oil moed lo yiviyoi." It didn't enter the door of the oil moed. How did it get on the roof? It had to have entered the doors of the oil moed. So clearly, if you're going to hold that on the roof of the oil moed, on the roof of the heichel, it's going to be considered shchut echutz, then the Torah should not have said "Val Pesach oil moed lo yiviyoi."
Yosy,
Yes.
didn't we learn somewhere that the
Kedusha goes all the way up, airspace.
I don't know if the Kedusha goes all the way up and if it has a din of the Azara, but we're discussing if it's going to be Chayv al Shchut Echutz, which have different parameters. You know, the Gemara wanted to suggest that if you shechted the animal b'daraim, it's not going to be Shchut Echutz. It's not a kosher shchita. If you shecht an animal b'daraim, it's a pasul of carbon, but it still doesn't qualify as Shchut Echutz. So I don't think the shaila as to whether or not it will be Shchut Echutz will determine if it's Kedusha's Azara and if you could shecht it. Look, it could be for sure it's not a good shchita, but it doesn't mean you violated Shchut Echutz. No, it's very funny because sometimes we learn a case and someone asks me, that case is almost impossible to unlikely. Somehow over here, the Ilim accepted it because in their mind, they still have that name of the restaurant calendar. Zok to Gemara weiter. Well, it was God in the vase, that's right. Well, if you put a bull on the roof, it crashes through, you know. Im Kain, Maskal became nicht lekra on the chutz mach loy boy al Pesach al Moed Lam Ali Lam lemute gaga. Clearly, the gag hamizbeach, the gag heichel would not be chai, of course. According to Rava, then weiter it's schwer. Im Kain nichtav al Pesach al Moed b'machna. That's all it should have said. Al Pesach al Moed b'machna. Michutz l'machna lamli. Why do I even need the words of michutz l'machna? Lav lasuye gagoy. It must be to tell you that michutz l'machna also prohibits gagoy. So it's a kash on Rabba. Zok to Gemara, Amar Mori. Maybe according to Rava, the michutz l'machna is not telling me that gagoy is called shchut echutz. It's telling me lesuye kula b'fnim v'tzavar b'chutz. And to tell you that what if the whole animal was in the azara, but the neck of the animal was sticking out of the azara, that's also called shchut echutz. For the Gemara, for that I don't need a pasuk. Tzavar b'chutz pshita. That's where the shchita is occurring outside of the azara. Am I kabod rachmona? I shchita. If the neck is outside of the azara, ushchita b'chutzi. Ela l'suyei kula b'chutz v'tzavar b'fnim. Maybe the pasuk is telling you that if the entire animal is out of the azara, and only its neck is in the azara for the shchita, that is also considered shchutei chutz, and that'll also be chayiv. So at the end of the day, so that's stop. Okay, so I'll stop. Itmar, shkoyach v'tomi. Itmar, hamayla bizman hazeh. Nowadays, is there a problem of shchutei chutz? And it will depend on whether or not we have the kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash today. And I was listening to a small piece of Rabbi Rosenblum, or Baruch Rosenblum. I believe that he gives out his shiur on CD, Ari Stoltzman. So I was listening to a little piece of him, and he said from the Chassam Sofer that Asar B'Tevis every year is like a transitional day. It's the day where HaKadosh Baruch Hu Paskins is Mashiach coming this year. The Davka Asar B'Tevis, and therefore it's a day of great tefillah, and that'll determine whether or not we're going to be going back to the Beis Hamikdash or not. So maybe that's somewhat relevant to this Gemara now. Itmar hamayla bizman hazeh. Nowadays, do we say we have kedusha Beis Hamikdash since we know eventually it's going to come back? Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev, Rish Lakish Amar Pot. Rish Yochanan says the din of shchut echut applies today. Rish Lakish says it does not. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayev, because kedusha rishayna kitchel l'shaita v'kitchel osed lavai. So there's still kedusha mizbech there. It's like kedusha mikdash there. And Rish Lakish Amar Potter kedusha rishayna kitchel l'shaita l'kitchel osed lavai. There's no more kedusha. Nema, let's say the beplukted the Rabbi Lezer of Rabbi Shua come in. Let's suggest that this machlokes of Mayroyim between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish hinges in the machlokes of Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua. It's not Amar Belezer because you boin in behechal when they used to build the hechal, how you oisin kloyim behechal. They would build the footprint of the hechal before they built the stone walls. They built the footprint of the hechal with curtains and kloyim ba'azaris. The difference was between the azara, the positioning of the curtains to look like the azara, and the positioning of the curtains to look like the heichal is the curtains of the heichal were on the inside perimeter of where the wall would have been. So when they were building the stone walls, they were building around the outside of those curtains. But the azara, the curtains were outside the perimeter of the azara, and they were building for the stones from within. Rabbi Yeshua, Shemaiti, I heard, Shahayu Makriven. I heard they would be Makrav Karbonis of Bishain Bayis, even without a Beis Hamikdash, which sounds like you didn't need the curtains. The eight kachakachim in what was called the Azara, Ava Bishain Kloim. And the eight kachim column in the Mashasheni, Ava Bishain Chayma, even though there was no Chayma around Yerushalayim. Why? The Nesha Kedusha Rishoyna Kitchel Ashaita V'Kitchel Lasid Lava. Now, Rabbi Eliezer isn't directly contradicting Rabbi Yeshua, but it's mashma that if Rabbi Yeshua says you don't need curtain, you don't need any of these things because there's a kedusha there anyway. It's mashma according to Rabbi Eliezer they made these curtains so that it should be like a minimalistic binyan Beis Hamikdash, so that the kedusha should be there already. Lav Mechlal, wouldn't you agree with me? Rabbi Eliezer sover loy kitcha, and therefore that the machlokes Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Amal Ravina Ravashi, no, mimai. Maybe everybody agrees it's kitchel l'shaita v'kitchel l'asad lavai, and all those curtains that Rabbi Eliezer is talking about, it had nothing to do with the kedusha. Rather, each one of these two tzaddikim, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua, umar ma'dishmiya le'kamar, umar ma'dishmiya le'kamar. They were just saying over what the Rabbis taught them, but they weren't trying to impact halacha. Rabbi Eliezer was just saying they had curtains there, not that that had anything to do with the kedusha. So if it had nothing to do with the kedusha, why did they need it there? Maybe it was like Obama when they're building, they didn't need the whole place working, right? A lot of times they put the barriers around the construction site. I remember when the Koil in Lakewood was like a month behind on Koil checks, and Punkt at that time where Malkiel was renovating his house, so of course they didn't want everybody walking by to see, or they don't look good. So they built like a construction barrier around the whole house, so you couldn't see, it was just plywood. And people were putting signs up that said, your Koil checks hard at work. Because he used to say like on the highway during construction. So Itmar, Hamayla ve'ein b'zayis. What if someone was Mayla b'chutz, but there's not a kazayis? There's not a kazayis of meat. So therefore, there wouldn't be a chiyuv. But the etzem mashlima the kazayis. But if you count the bone that was in the piece of meat that was put up there, it would be a kazayis. Rabbi Yochanan Merchayev will be chayev or shlokish over potter. Rabbi Yochanan Merchayev because chibure oilen dame. The meat which is connected to the bone also will be mitzvah kazayis while they're connected. The shlokish over potter because chibure oilen lav koilim dam. Boy Rabba. So first Rabba the following shaila. Hamayla Roish ben Yoina, the head of a little bird, Shem Bekazayis, is not even a Kazayis, but Umelach Mashlima la Kazayis. But it says I'll call carbon Chotakriv Melach. So with this the salt, the mass was a Kazayis. Ma, what would Allah be? Amole Rabba mi Parsakaya la Ravashi. Rabba from Parsakaya asked Ravashi the following Allah. Lav Haini Plutayu Rabbi Yochanan B'Shlokish. Shouldn't you say this the exact machlokes? What's the difference if it's salt or if it's a bone? By a bone, there's a machlokes if the bone is mitzaref l'kazayis. Rabbi Akiva holds, Rabbi Yochanan holds yes, Rabbi Shlokish holds no. So why should salt be any different? Zok Gemara no. Tiboiler Rabbi Yochanan, Tiboiler Rabbi Shlokish. This shaila has nothing to do with a bone. Why? Tiboiler Rabbi Yochanan, Atkan like Rabbi Yochanan Hasam el etzem demina de basaru. The meat and the bone, it's one shtickle. So that's why the bone can be mitzaref l'kazayis. A melech, which is an external additive. The lav mina de bar yoinu, it's not a part of the bird, it's added on. Loy. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan would agree that that's not mitzvah for kazayis. And even to boiler Reish Lakish, who holds the bone doesn't count. Al kan like Reish Lakish hasam melody parishim noy lav mitzvah lasuke. If the bone fell off, there's no mitzvah to put it back onto the mizbeach because the bone isn't really part of what it has to be hukra. Aval hacha di parish by salt. If the salt fell off the bird while it's on the mizbeach, mitzvah lasuke, you got to go back and salt it again. So you see salt might be more of an integral part of the carbon. Loy idilma loy shna teku. The Gemara blabs to take. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we got up to kach. We should take. And Mishnah tomorrow we'll take more Gemara.